Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 19th educational webinar. My name is Tariq Khalil. I am the education coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine. This is a very, very important topic. This is regarding Israel's attack on human rights and civil society organizations. And we have with us a phenomenal panel. We have one of them still trying to log in. Her name is Marjorie Cohn. Hopefully she'll be logging in soon enough. But I have with me right now three awesome panelists. I'll just briefly introduce them, and we'll take it from there. We have Miranda Cleland, who is an advocacy and communications officer at Defense for Children International-Palestine, and where she works to protect and promote the rights of Palestinian children by supporting campaigns around the world. Miranda has a bachelor's with honors from American University School of International Service, where she studied sustainable urbanism and Arabic language and literature. We have with us as well Melina Ansari, who is an international advocacy officer at Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which is a Palestinian human rights organization that works to support and advocate on behalf of Palestinian political prisoners held in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. And Adamir is actually one of the 6 targeted organizations that we'll be discussing today. Before working at Adamir, Melina was the Right to Education Project Coordinator at Defense for Children International-Palestine. And we also have with us Deanna Buttu, who is a lawyer specializing in negotiations, international law, and international human rights law. She was a former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization and was the only female negotiator during her 5-year tenure. She's also policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, Palestinian Policy Network. She was also recently a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And we have on, finally, Marjorie Cohn. Thank you for joining us. She's a professor emeritus at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, former president of the National Lawyers Guild and member of the NLG Palestine Subcommittee and Jewish Voice for Peace. Marjorie is a legal and political analyst who writes a regular column for Truth Out and does frequent media commentary. She's a co-host of the nationally broadcast radio show Law and Disorder. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for making it just on time. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, Marjorie, but thank you for making it. You can hear us very well, and hopefully we can hear you.
Great.
Okay, so I just want to throw it out. I want you to just tackle this question from your own perspective and give the audience some context as to why Israel decided to target these 6 organizations and designate them as terrorist groups. And we'll start with Melina Ansari and just go down the row.
First of all, thank you everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be speaking amongst this panel and to everyone who's watching. To begin with, when we first heard about the designation based on the Israeli counterterrorism law of 2016, and later it was followed by an Israeli military order that outlawed the 6 organizations in the West Bank as well. We were surprised because it was 6 organizations all at once, but we weren't surprised because for a long time, the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime has been implementing a campaign of harassment against Palestinian civil society organizations and Palestinian human rights defenders. So this recent attack and designation and raidings and closure is not something new to us. For years, we have been facing such attacks by the Israeli occupation. So it's basically very easy. We understand why the goal of such campaigns happen against civil society. It is basically to silence any criticism that's exposing the Israeli occupation's violations against the Palestinian people as a whole. It's also to evade accountability, because most of the organizations from the 6 who were targeted and designated as terrorist organizations also work with the United Nations. We work with the ICC to provide them with cases of victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the whole of Palestine. So it's silencing, it's evading accountability, and it's also isolating Palestinian civil society. With all humbleness, I do say this. our organizations for the past years have been calling the Israeli occupation an apartheid regime. We have reports and documentation regarding the systematic and widespread extrajudicial killings, persecution of Palestinians, no guarantees of fair trial standards for prisoners and detainees, and many other war crimes. So we've been calling Israel apartheid for many years. And the good thing is we are being heard. Recently, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have also recognized Israel as an apartheid regime. Adding to that, Beit Salem, which is an Israeli NGO that also characterized what Israel is doing in these territories as an apartheid regime. So we believe that with this paradigm shift and this power dynamics shift in the international community, the Israeli occupation has understood the role of Palestinian civil society in exposing their violations and gross crimes for against human rights. We've been, Al-Damir itself has been raided 3 times now, with the most recent raid 2 weeks ago. We've been raided in 2012 and 2019. And in 2019, we were documenting cases of systematic torture and ill treatment in Al-Maskoubiya Interrogation Center in Jerusalem. And then files and materials were confiscated from our offices. So it's when the Israeli occupation feels that they are in a corner in the international arena, where the internationals who care about true justice and accountability are listening to us, that they have this counter attack of calling us terrorist organizations based on their extreme vague definitions of terrorism. So it's basically, these are the reasons of why the designation and the assault on Palestinian human rights and civil society is happening. I want to give more time to my fellow colleagues.
Thank you very much. You put a lot of important information there, and the context is definitely needed. That this is not unprecedented. This is not the first time. This is not the first Israeli assault on human rights organizations, but it's definitely one that has caught a lot of attention. Deanna, same question to you.
I completely agree. It's obviously to do that, and it's also a step further. One of the things that Israel has been doing for over the course of the past 5 decades is actually 7 decades, is that it's trying to systematically destroy and break down any form of Palestinian resistance. So we saw that originally they went after our political leadership through, and continue to, through this process of assassinations. And then after they've moved on from the political leadership and the assassination of that, they've since moved on to even people who are in any way, shape, or form resisting. And from there, they've now taken it one step further. They've also gone so far as to attack the Palestinian Authority. And the human rights organizations remain the only force of resistance that is still pushing back against Israel. And so it's not at all surprising that now this attack is coming against human rights organizations, and of course coming against the human rights organizations that Melanie already mentioned that are trying to push for some measure of accountability. We're talking about Al-Haq, which is, I believe, the oldest human rights organization, established in 1979, that has been not only documenting, but has been pressing for accountability by pushing for national legislation in different countries, pushing for sanctions in different countries. They've been pushing on the BDS front, and of course they've been pushing at the ICC. It's also not at all surprising that they are attacking DCI because of the fact that DCI, and get this, I mean, what country, first of all, throws kids in jail, but then attacks the organization that is trying to defend kids that are being thrown in prison, again, as an attempt to try to shut that down. Or, for example, Damir, which has spent decades really pushing back and trying to at least provide some protection to Palestinian political prisoners. this is not at all surprising, because on each and every level, what they're aiming to do is to shut down Palestinian society and shut down all forms of resistance, whether that resistance is on a political level, whether that resistance is on a civil society level, whether it's on a human rights level, on any level. The aim is to try to crush it. Now, it's not just that, but they're also trying to stop funding for these organizations. This has been a long-standing marriage that they've had between organizations like NGO Monitor and the Israeli government together, which have been trying to stop funding to these organizations. But they're also trying to send, like a chilling effect to make sure that people who are in any way affiliated, who are working for these organizations, begin to think twice, 3 times before they work for them, because they're worried that potentially they could be thrown in prison, that there will be a travel ban put on them. All of this, Thaddeuk, is an attempt to really shut down any form of resistance against Israel's military occupation.
And the irony is quite striking. Melina, you mentioned B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization. They put out a statement, and I'm just going to quote just one sentence of it. This regime, referring to Israeli apartheid regime, considers violent repression a legitimate tool to control Palestinians, yet defines nonviolent civil activity as terrorism. So it's kind of, a 180 of how of what is right and what is wrong. Marjorie, Cohn, hopefully we can hear you very well. The question was, if you didn't hear prior, is why do you believe Israel decided to target these 6 civil society organizations and designate them as terrorists?
Well, in March of 2021, the prosecutor of the ICC announced that that the ICC had launched a formal investigation into war crimes committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, since Israel's 2014 so-called Operation Protective Edge. And Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who is the one who made the terrorist organization designation in the first place, was head of the Israeli military when it killed more than 2,200 Palestinians, at least 1,492 civilians, 437 of them children. And Benny Gantz later bragged that he had sent Gaza back to the Stone Age. The ICC, International Criminal Court, is also investigating Israel's building of illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the transfer by Israel, the occupying power, of its own civilians onto occupied Palestinian land. Now, the director of Al-Haq, which was already mentioned, Shawan Jabarin, said that Al-Haq crossed the red line when it provided assistance to the ICC's investigation of Israeli war crimes. And Jabarin's attorney, Michael Safard, said it all starts and ends with the fact that these organizations are seen as promoting a boycott of Israel, BDS, and the investigation of war crimes at the International Criminal Court. The attack on them is a political one under the guise of security. Now, Jabarin also noted the irony of these terrorist designations. He says, Gantz says we are a terrorist organization when he himself is a war criminal. And journalist Jonathan Cook said, the reality is that Israel's leaders are conflating their own terror at being held to account for their crimes with an imagined terrorism being waged by lawyers and researchers trying to show the reality of occupation. And Al-Haq called on the international community to implement concrete measures such as trade restrictions and arms embargoes to ensure that Israel is held internationally responsible for its ongoing systematic inhumane acts of apartheid, including the persecution of Palestinian human rights defenders. And in addition, Al-Haq urged the state's parties to the Rome Statute for the ICC and the ICC prosecutor to intervene and submit evidence to the court. If there's one thing that Israel does not want, and Israel's chief benefactor, the United States, does not want, it is Israeli leaders in the dock in criminal prosecutions in the International Criminal Court. And again, they also consider BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, a nonviolent form of resistance, to be an existential threat to Israel.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for bringing in the ICC element there. And I want our viewers to understand that when the state of Palestine lodged the declaration, it's for crimes that were committed since Operation Protective Edge, but with no end date. So this can also consume what's happened. That will also include what's happening right now and what's happening tomorrow and after as well. So let's keep that in mind. Miranda Cleland, thank you so much for waiting so patiently. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Tarek. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to American Muslims for Palestine for bringing us all together and hosting this space today. I'd actually like to answer this question by telling everybody a little bit about what Defense for Children International-Palestine does, because I think learning a little bit more about what we do actually answers this question straight away. So some of my colleagues here have mentioned that one thing that DCIP does is defend Palestinian children in the Israeli military court system. If you're not familiar, Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank are subject to Israeli military law, where court hearings are conducted entirely in Hebrew by members of the Israeli military. Palestinians, including children, can be detained without charge for indefinite periods of time. This is a cruel tool of the Israeli military known as administrative detention. This Israeli military detention system impacts about 500 to 700 Palestinian children every year. Those are children who are detained, arrested, interrogated, tortured, prosecuted in this military court system. This court system has a conviction rate upwards of 95%. So that means you could go through a so-called trial and still be convicted regardless of any evidence or anything else, simply because this is not a justice system that we are talking about here. This is a system of control and oppression designed to control the Palestinian population. So one thing that we do is provide free legal aid to Palestinian children who have been ensnared in this system and try to get them out as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. Whatever the quickest route to getting children out of custodial detention is what we're focused on. Another thing that we do is document and expose Israeli violations of Palestinian children's rights. So I'm talking about whenever a Palestinian child is killed or injured by the Israeli military or Israeli settlers, whenever they are detained, tortured, ill-treated, whenever they are isolated in solitary confinement in their detention. So these are all things that we track the numbers on, we track the data to keep abreast of trends, to use them in international advocacy, and to inform other human rights organizations in the United Nations, governments around the world, what the numbers are for these cases. And we also aim to show the human side of these cases, right? Because these children are not just numbers in a spreadsheet. You know, this is not a one-off case where an Israeli soldier shot and killed a Palestinian child, but this is a killing that leaves a gaping, enormous hole in a family, in a community, with that child's friends, with their football teammates, their younger siblings. It's important to recognize that each of these human rights violations has a huge, enormous ripple effect on Palestinian families and communities, and that's on purpose. It's another example of how these violations are a tool of Israeli control and oppression of the Palestinian population. The last thing that I'll mention is we're also involved and lead a number of successful international advocacy campaigns in the United States and Europe, such as the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. So we are always engaging with grassroots groups and lawmakers. And as several of my colleagues here today have mentioned, we are involved in the International Criminal Court case and are the legal representative for Palestinian child victims who have been killed since 2014.
Miranda, sounds like you do human rights work. It's pretty much
Something
what it
like
is.
that. Something like that.
Just to add a little bit to what Miranda said regarding administrative detentions. Usually what happens is a Palestinian is detained without legal proceedings and the evidence is classified. It's not revealed to them. The detainees become helpless because the allegations lodged against them are unknown and therefore virtually impossible to disprove. They're not charged, tried, or convicted and have no idea when they'll be released. So just imagine that happening to your children and trying to figure out a way to defend them, not knowing what it is that you're trying to defend. So I wanted to get a little deeper into the designations themselves. So this is based on a 2016 counterterrorism law that was made into a military order and applied to Palestinians in the West Bank. In this law, a terrorist act is defined as an act that constitutes an offense or a threat to carry out such an act, which is carried out for a political, religious, nationalistic, or ideological motive, and with the intention of compelling the government to do or abstain from doing any act. That's a lot of nothing. Any kind of act can fit that definition. Can you comment on the broad outline and the broad definition of terrorism and terrorist and how dangerous that is, and how these Palestinian organizations, these civil society organizations and other organizations can defend this in court? Because when you're talking about countering these charges, you have to prove that you're not a terrorist organization. But anybody, any kind of act can essentially fit that script. So can you guys please speak to that? Deanna, we can start with you.
Sure.
I know you're laughing. I mean, it's laughable. I know. It's slightly laughable, but
no, it's laughable because in Israel's definition, anything where there is any form of resistance to Israel's apartheid, to military rule, is considered to be terrorist in their mindset. I mean, it's a word that has no meaning any longer. And so here's the problem: is that these organizations that want to challenge this designation, they're forced to do so using the Israeli court system, which is a court system that is illegal, that has no right whatsoever to be ruling over anything when it comes to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And for since the start of the military occupation, 1967 military occupation, all of these human rights organizations have boycotted the Israeli courts for good reason, because these are illegal courts. So the only way that this can be done is by using the internal Israeli logic, is by going to an Israeli court and challenging the designation before an Israeli court. And yet these are organizations that are operating in the West Bank, and Israeli courts do not apply, or rather should not apply when it comes to, an Israeli law should not apply when it comes to the West Bank. I want to just raise something that is really important here so that people can understand the difference. When they're in the context of military occupation, which is what this is, Israel has zero rights, absolutely zero right to pass any form of legislation when it comes to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. None whatsoever. Under international humanitarian law, under occupiers' law, they can only pass laws that are for the benefit of the people who are living under occupation, in other words, the Palestinians, or in small cases when it comes to protection of their soldiers. That's it. They can't enact any other legislation. And what Israel's been trying to do is it's always trying to reach in and apply its laws into the West Bank. And at the same time is resisting this idea that somehow it's apartheid. Of course it's apartheid. So the problem here is that we have this overbroad definition. And the only way that you can effectively challenge this is two ways. One is you go directly to the Israeli courts. But given that the Israeli courts should not at all be applicable here, then obviously these human rights organizations are not going to use that court. Or the second is to go the right of international advocacy, which is what they have done. And we've seen that whether it's the individual countries of the European Union, the European Commission, even the United States came out and said that the dossier that they received when it came to these 6 organizations was incredibly, as they put it, thin. And so the only thing that can be done is to push for this designation to be removed by Israel without having to debase themselves and going to an Israeli court and recognize the legitimacy of an Israeli court when it is not legitimate whatsoever. And just one last thing, Tarek, so that people are aware, this isn't the first designation these are the first organizations that have come under this designation. They also outlawed the Islamic movement of the North that is inside 48 Palestine as well, and shut down those offices as well, again under the same overbroad structure.
Yeah, no, that was an absolutely perfect point to end on, because the audience needs to understand, and the American people need to understand, and the world needs to understand that Israel, and if you look at the Amnesty International apartheid report, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, they don't refer to it as apartheid state as Israel, apartheid regime, and this regime encompasses the entirety of historic Palestine and the refugees that are living outside. So it's not just limited to within that geographic scope, but encompasses Palestinians from all communities. Amnesty International laid that out beautifully. And just to just add a little bit more context here, so that our audience understands that, and it's been said multiple times already, that in the West Bank, there's a dual legal system. So military rules and laws apply to the Palestinians. Israeli civil laws, which are less restrictive, less punitive, apply to the Jewish settlers, which is now 650,000 plus individuals. So that's, if that doesn't spell apartheid, I don't know what does. That's clearly separate and unequal, So I just wanted to lay that out. Lena, did you want to respond to that counterterrorism overbroadness of the terrorist label? Go ahead.
Well, it's more than, if you ever see this counterterrorism law of 2016, it's more than 200 pages long. But of course, it's all nonsense, as you mentioned.
I read the English version. I don't know about the Hebrew version.
It's nonsense, broad and very vague. The issue with it, how I see it as well, is 3 main problems. It's not only the vague definitions, because that alone is an issue. Under international law, as we all know, terrorism is not defined by international law. It's still something that no one has ever agreed on to what is the definition of terrorism. But how they use terrorist organizations and how do they define them, that these organizations don't have to necessarily engage in activities that are terrorist activities, directly or indirectly. Like, as long as they do any kind of activity that may contribute or assist another terrorist organization, they are still defined as terrorist organizations. And when we say terrorist activities, these could also include legal procedures. For example, 2 of the lawyers that are representing 2 of the organizations that are designated as terrorist organizations, sadly, I think it's DCIP and Al-Haq, their lawyers were also threatened by Israel, and by telling their lawyers that by the way, if you do legal services for these organizations, you are complicit in their activities, and you could be held accountable under the Israeli counterterrorism law. So even legal representation, which is what we do, legal representation, is also considered a terrorist act again, under this counterterrorism law. The other problem is due process, and this was already mentioned. The designation came based on secret information at the end of the day. When our legal representation wanted to appeal the decision in military courts on the Israeli military order, specifically because Al-Damir didn't appeal the designation as a terrorist organization, because as mentioned, these are Israeli laws. They should not be applying on Palestinian organizations that work in Palestine and are registered in Palestine. So there's no due process. We ask the military commander, send us whatever information you have so we can counteract, so we can have some kind of due process. And the answer was, the core reason of this outlawing is secret information. And as you mentioned, administrative detention is a systematic policy that the Israeli occupation relies on. It's the use of secret information that detains currently 743 Palestinians are detained under secret information for an indefinite time, including 4 children, 2 women, and 3 Palestinian Legislative Council members. So from 30 years of the work of Al-Damir, we understand that these secret evidence are basically absolutely nothing. They are just something that the Israeli occupation uses to justify whatever illegitimate act that they are doing. And sorry, one last thing about the counterterrorism law is the criminal liability aspect or section about it. So after the designation, or what this entails, that Israel can siege all our property, regardless if it directly is involved in the organization's activities or indirectly, again. So laptops, computers, and what we have seen in the last raid 2 weeks ago, the Union for Palestinian Women's Committee was completely emptied. Their offices don't even have chairs or printers or any equipment. So this is part of the negative impact or the consequences of such designations and outlawing. The heads of the organizations can get up to 25 years. The managers in the organizations can get 10 to 15 years. The employees or whoever provides services to these organizations, like printing companies or whatever, can get 5 years of imprisonment as well. So this is the broadness that we talk about. There's no understanding or no case-by-case basis or anything. It is a law, as mentioned. It's basically to cut any form of resistance for the Palestinian people, cut any hope to see a free Palestine or to follow the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. One final thing, we keep saying that Israel has been recognized as an apartheid regime, but we also need to go back to the root causes, the root problem. It was first established as a settler colonial regime, and that itself entails also broader crimes against humanity and war crimes. So when we talk about what the Palestinians need, it's at the end of the day self-determination for all the Palestinian people, whether in the diaspora, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, occupied 1948 territories. And this law itself, this is what it does. It restricts any possible form of resistance for Palestinians, whether it's legitimate or, I don't want to say illegitimate, because the ICJ did say, the occupied people, in the advisory wall opinion, that the occupied people have the right to resist in any form. But I don't want to create any, but this is something to bear in mind, that even human rights work based on international law is considered terrorist activities and illegitimate activities. It's all part of silencing and evading accountability and cutting any sense of self-determination for the Palestinians.
No, absolutely, Melina, and thank you for providing that necessary context. And in the joint letter, which we'll talk about later, the CIA had since October to look at Israel's documents or whatever evidence that they had, and there was no substantiation whatsoever that any of these organizations fit the label of terrorist organizations. So even our own CIA and European countries as well, they found this outside the scope, just to put it mildly. So it's absolutely ludicrous. But Marjorie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I just want to clarify these two legal challenges to both the counterterrorism law of 2016 and the 1945 Defense Emergency Regulations, the latter of which was used in November of last year to declare these 6 organizations unlawful associations. They're vague because ordinary rational people wouldn't know from reading the law what is prohibited by the law. That means it's vague. And overbroad means that it subsumes not just illegal conduct, but legal conduct as well. It's overbroad. It doesn't distinguish between acts that are lawful and acts that are unlawful. Now, in terms of the unlawful associations, that is defined as a body of persons declared by the Israeli military commander to be an unlawful association, period. No guidance about how that is done. And it's completely discretionary, unconditioned. An organization need not even engage in or support any act of terrorism in order to be declared an unlawful association. And as has been mentioned, the regimes for both of these laws, the counterterrorism law and the defense emergency regulations, lack due process because these military orders are not immediately reviewable by any court or tribunal, even if the Palestinians wanted to go to Israeli courts. They don't have any opportunity to meaningfully challenge these designations because they're based on secret evidence. Secret evidence. How can you defend yourself against secret evidence? And the basis of due process, which is something that is enshrined in international treaties as well as other US law, Israeli law, etc., means being confronted with the evidence against you and an opportunity to counteract it. And so it's vague because we don't know what violates these laws. It's overbroad because it punishes legal and illegal conduct. And there's no due process because it's based on secret evidence and there's no way to meaningfully counteract these designations.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't just mention, just in a brief paragraph, what these organizations represent and what they do. They pretty much handle the full spectrum of issues of international concern. So children's rights, DCI, prisoners' rights, women's rights, socioeconomic rights, rights of farm workers, and justice and accountability for international crimes. So that's what these 6 organizations represent, and that's what they do on a daily basis. I want to talk about just briefly the joint letter from the 6 organizations to President Biden demanding action. And I mean, I don't know if anything happened in the last 38 minutes that we've been doing this, but so far there's been no action on the part of this administration. So can you respond to why, considering the fact that the CIA found that there's no evidence to substantiate these claims, considering that US officials have not been able to find any evidence to substantiate these claims, same thing with European countries. Why doesn't the Biden administration just come out and, say that at the very least, remove the designations, not stop your apartheid regime or end the occupation, just remove the designations? Whoever wants to jump in on that, go right ahead. Go ahead, Marjorie.
The Biden administration, as you said, refuses to condemn both the terrorist designations and the illegal raids of these organizations. Ned Price, who's the State Department spokesperson, said, well, the United States is concerned about the raids, but We're waiting for further information from Israel. Israel cites security concerns. Israel cites terrorist threats. We will be looking to the information that they provide to us as we form our own judgment regarding these organizations and recent actions. Well, they've had since October to look at this so-called dossier. The CIA has said there is no evidence supporting the terrorist designations. But the bottom line is that the United States government, be it a Democratic regime or a Republican regime, uncritically supports Israel in everything it does and finances the illegal occupation, the military occupation, to the tune of $3.8 billion a year in military assistance. Once in a while, you might hear some lame criticism. Well, Israel, you shouldn't build so many settlements on Palestinian land or disputed land. They don't even call it occupied territory. And Israel said, what? And the U.S. says, oh, sorry, we didn't mean it. Israel could not maintain its illegal occupation of Palestinian lands, its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This goes beyond apartheid. Its settler colonialism, its illegal occupation without U.S. support. And so there is no way that the Biden administration, like all the administrations before him, are going to come out and meaningfully tell Israel, no, you've gone too far. It's just not going to happen. The same way that the United States, which refuses to join the International Criminal Court, and yet 100 U.S. senators who can't agree on anything say, well, the ICC should prosecute Russians for their war crimes in Ukraine, but the ICC isn't competent enough to prosecute Israeli leaders for their war crimes, and U.S. leaders, by the way, as well, for what they did in Afghanistan. So there's this incredible double standard. The U.S. uncritically supports, sponsors, and enables the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands by Israel. And unfortunately, that is not going to change anytime soon.
I wanted to just jump in, Tariq, and just
Please.
add a couple of points to Marjorie's very excellent points, and just ask a basic question: when has the United States ever challenged Israel? I mean, just look at what has happened over the course of the past year. I mean, just a small little period. We've had in January of this year. A Palestinian American man who's 80 years old, named Omar Assad, was killed by Israel. And nothing happened. Zero happened. In May of this year, prominent Palestinian American journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, killed by a sniper. And we know exactly who shot her. We know exactly who gave those orders. They know exactly who did that. Nothing. And then if you look back when it comes to this particular designation, I don't think that it's at all coincidental that immediately after this designation came out in October of 2021, remember, this is a dossier that they themselves have said is thin, that we saw that the head of one of the organizations, Arbeid, who himself is a U.S. citizen, was barred from traveling to the U.S., was barred from leaving the West Bank and traveling to the U.S. by the Israelis, and the Americans said nothing. And then the head of another organization, Damir, we have Milena here excellently representing Damir as always, Sahar Francis, who was on her way to a conference, transiting through the United States, had her U.S. visa revoked. This is not at all coincidental. So the bigger question is, when has the United States ever done anything when it comes to Israel? And we know that answer. And the answer is never. They have never, and they will never. And so this is why it's so vitally important for us to keep to get rid of this illusion that somehow the United States is going to do something, but instead be pushing through all of these other channels that are out there and that exist.
And that is why, I mean, those are all excellent points, and that is why in that joint letter, and you see these in a lot of letters throughout decades. It's condemn the current assault, whatever assault that is. And in this case, it would be to rescind the designations, protect our staff, our equipment, our assets, etc. Don't undermine Palestinian pursuit toward justice and accountability, and end complicity and financial aid and diplomatic support to the Israeli apartheid regime. I mean, that's how the letter ends. That's the focus. And, I know that we mention it a lot and we state it a lot, and there is a shift in the U.S. I'm talking specifically about the United States right now. There is a shift in public opinion because of us emphasizing what is happening. So we're emphasizing it so strongly, not because we think that Biden is going to call the next day and convince the Prime Minister Lapid to remove the designations, or obviously that would be something remarkable, but that's not why that's done. It's done to show that why this is wrong. We can't just sit and accept it. So that this is very crucial to our activism, and we're seeing that in the polls, and we're seeing that in public opinion, that the younger generation is becoming more aware of what is happening on the ground, and they're responding accordingly. There was a question from the audience here that I wanted to just present. Let me see, where is it? Okay. Is there any way that Israel can be compelled externally to apply civil laws? And they have the example here of habeas corpus to Palestinians. Deanna, is that something that you think that you can respond to?
You mean to say that so that people can be released from prison?
I believe the meaning of the question is so that you can compel Israel or Israeli officials.
Yeah, they do. There is a procedure. The bigger problem is that much of the evidence that is used. Look, let me back up. There's a couple of mechanisms that are in place inside Israel, which is unlike what is in place in the United States. The main one is that Milena already referred to, and actually we've been hearing, I'm sure people have heard about this before, which is that Israel has a mechanism by which people, they can they can detain somebody, arrest them, but hold them without charge and without trial. And this can be renewed. This detention can be renewed and renewed and renewed. Now, under that system, they do have to appear before a judge whenever they want to renew this. But the military courts are effectively a rubber stamp when it comes to whatever it is that the security establishment wants. So just to give you an example, Sha'wan Jabarin, the head of Al-Haq, spent over 8 years in an Israeli prison without ever being charged with a single crime. He never faced charges. He never faced a trial, nothing. That's what administrative detention is that they can be brought in and thrown into jail without charge, without trial. Miranda also mentioned, and this is very important to note, that it's not just when it comes to adults, that this is also a procedure that is very frequently, very often used when it comes to children as well. And so the processes that one would normally think that are normally in place when it comes to other countries are not in place in Israel, because they have the ability to throw somebody in prison without charge and without trial. All they have to do is bring them before a judge, and the judge rubber stamps that detention. Just 2 days ago, we've seen that a Palestinian journalist from Jerusalem she was taken from in the middle of the night from her house. She's the mother of 2, taken from her home, and her detention continually is being renewed. She has no idea why it is that she was taken in, and she has no idea what the charges are. So yes, you can appear before a judge, but the problem is that this is not a country where there's a separation of powers in the sense that there's the oversight. This is a country where the courts are used precisely as a mechanism to rubber stamp anything that the security establishment wants. This isn't a court that seeks to examine or to challenge or to really look into what the government is doing. It simply seeks to find different ways to be able to rubber stamp what Israel's doing and to give it this legal veneer. And of course, it's not legal. This is why there has been such a pushback. And the only way that people have been able to push back against this system of administrative detention is by using their own bodies and starving themselves to literal death. That has been the only effective mechanism so far to challenge the system. So yes, there is a system that's in place in theory, but in practice, it doesn't work at all because of this ability to be able to throw somebody in jail without charge, without trial.
And go ahead, Marjorie. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Diana said, Israel is a party to a treaty called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that treaty protects the right of habeas corpus. In other words, the right to go before a judge and say, I am being wrongfully held. Give me an opportunity to prove that. It also protects the right to be informed of the charges against you and the right to a speedy trial and other fair trial rights. And the Human Rights Committee, which is the administrative body that administers the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, requires that each party, such as Israel, report on its progress under this treaty periodically. And then the Human Rights Committee will come back and say, you have violated, you're not in compliance with the treaty, you violated these provisions. And that creates what we call the mobilization of shame, which means that Israel is shamed in the eyes of the international community. That is not a strong penalty, but it is still significant. And there are some countries that have actually changed their practices in response to that. There's also the International Court of Justice, which could rule that Israel is in violation of the ICCPR, the way that it ruled that Israel violated international law by erecting the barrier wall and ordered Israel to take it down, which it hasn't done. The General Assembly could pass a resolution. That's the democratic body of the UN, and they do pass resolutions every year condemning Israel's occupation. The Security Council, the enforcement arm of the UN, would not be likely to criticize Israel at all because the United States, a permanent member of the Security Council, would veto that. So there are avenues in the international realm. Are they going to be effective and stop Israel's illegal administrative detention and lots of other violations of fair trial rights, including torture, which is also violates the ICCPR? Not likely in the near future.
Yeah, and Obama was lambasted for abstaining from 2334. We rarely see that in the Security Council, but and as you mentioned, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and one of those main minimalist guarantees is the presumption of innocence. You're presumed innocent, but it's the exact reverse with respect to Palestinians. Lena wanted to say something, but something happened with her connection. And
sorry.
There she is. All right,
Yeah.
go ahead,
Sorry.
Lena. It's okay.
Now when the internet cuts off randomly, paranoia hits in and anxiety. This is what the Israeli occupation does. It makes
They closed your offices and they closed your laptop.
It's not something bizarre for them. 6 employees from the organizations had Pegasus spyware on their phones. So
yeah.
Nothing is in the face of this occupation. But what I did want to say, and I hope I'm not repeating anyone, but to better understand why we don't call the Israeli judicial system justice system, because basically Israel has established a full apartheid regime, or a full establishment that uses legislative, judicial, and executive powers. So the Israeli military occupation, they arrest Palestinians on a day-to-day basis brutally in the middle of the during dawn raidings. But then they are brought before an Israeli military court where the judge is an Israeli military officer. Miranda mentioned this a bit more. And the prosecutor is an Israeli military officer as well. The language spoken is Hebrew, and the law itself is Israeli military law. So basically, they have provided themselves with a full package of detaining and arresting Palestinians and keeping them inside prison. One example I would really like to highlight is the use of torture and ill treatment. So if we're talking about designation and human rights, imagine ill treatment and torture, which is prohibited. There's a general prohibition, an absolute prohibition on torture. But recently, an Israeli high court ruled that testimonies taken after 3 days of torture are still valid because they weren't during when the torture was happening by interrogators. Of course, there's also another Israeli high court ruling that says Israeli interrogators may use moderated violence or torture against detainees in cases of necessity. So in a way, they provide themselves with legal loopholes that make whatever they do legitimate in their own sense. But of course, when we look at international law and international humanitarian law, that's completely in violation of the law. So you have students who, we've seen their list of charges, university students, it's selling falafel during a university activity or selling books at a low price during a student affair. So when they use laws that criminalize student groups, they make it so easy for themselves to arrest students in a systematic manner. So it's the whole system that needs to be abolished and not these small root causes. Like we mentioned hunger striking detainees. And the sad thing is the international community only opens their eyes when Palestinians are literally at imminent threat of death. Like when a hunger striking detainee has lost half of his weight body, that they are asking, okay, what we can do. But the problem isn't hunger strikes. The problem is administrative detention, detaining a person without charge. It's the military court system. It's the Israeli occupation. So I think why our organizations again were targeted is because we look at the root causes. We don't try to work on these small issues that actually the root causes are the problems. So sorry, just wanted to.
Right. No, yeah, absolutely. You're not tackling this on a case by case basis, but looking at the overarching structure itself. And then that's absolutely the reason why this is happening. And before I go to you, Miranda, I did want to just give a little bit of context on, Palestinian detainees and why the conviction rate is so high. And it was mentioned earlier. So when Palestinians will end up with a security record, whether they plead guilty or not. So prisoners, when they're there and they don't know how long they'll be there, they don't even know the charges against them, often feel they have no practical option but to take a plea bargain. And this means that these convictions in military courts are almost never based on evidence. So that's the crucial component here, is that when you read it on its face, if it's just a soundbite, which is what our mainstream media likes to do, is just focus on sound bites, you create your own story out of it and you get a completely wrong context, because context is that they're forced to do it and they don't even know why they're there in the first place. They don't know how long they're going to be there. So it's really a bizarre and obviously illegal situation. Miranda, please go ahead and comment.
Sure, thanks, Tarek. I was going back to the question that was shared in the comments. I was really struck by the word compel in this question, because that's the golden question, right? Is how can the international community compel Israel to change course on, anything? Pick your issue. And the truth is, it would take one phone call from the United States, of President Biden or the Secretary of State or anybody just saying, hey, we don't want you to do this anymore. And because, as my colleagues have mentioned, the U.S. provides $3.8 billion a year to the Israeli government. The U.S. wields a significant amount of influence over how the Israeli government acts. And so the truth, I mean, we're at the point now, we know that the US has reviewed the so-called evidence from the Israeli government about our organizations. Of course, this is not evidence that we have been allowed to see, but we know that the US has reviewed it and they are choosing not to do anything about it. So, I mean, that's really where we're at. And, you know, we've seen a lot of support over the last 10 months from really, I'd first like to call out grassroots organizers, really every corner of the world. I still think back to the first few days after the designation last October. Every time I like refresh my email inbox, the emails just were pouring in from every single corner of the world. And I keep thinking back to, there's this group in France that I cannot remember the name of, and apologies. And I hadn't interacted with them before, and I don't even know if DCIP had interacted with them before, but they sent us, they're like, oh, we put this statement on our website, and you know, we're thinking of you and we stand with you. And they ended with, we will not let you down. And I think about that all the time, and how grassroots organizers really around the world have been at the forefront of pushing back against these designations and these attacks on Palestinian civil society. We've seen some positive responses from governments. Just a couple of weeks ago, right before the August 18th attacks, 9 European governments put out a joint statement saying that they too have reviewed the evidence and didn't see anything significant and are planning to continue working with us. Of course, none of these statements have led to any significant action, and it's time. You know, this is an emergency. There's no like better way to put like, you know, I really wanted to kind of end with talking about the personal impact that this has had on the staff of all these organizations. Everybody that I know is working on very little sleep, working weekends, working all the time, trying to respond to this in any way that we can. Everybody is, you know, and I'm speaking also for myself, so nervous, so anxious. Everybody is so afraid that, you know, will I be arrested tomorrow? Will my colleagues be arrested tomorrow? Is my next paycheck going to hit my bank account? Will I be able to pay rent? There's just all these things that, you know, we talk about sort of the broader impacts on Palestinian civil society, which is also such an existential threat to the community as a whole. But it really boils down to such a personal impact on so many people. And, you know, and that even goes without saying the impact that this is having on the constituents of our organizations, because if we're spending all of our time and energy fighting this, then that's time and energy and money and resources that we're not able to spend, you know, documenting violations against Palestinian children or working with Palestinian prisoners or any of the other work that we are just trying to do every day.
And you know, thank you for that. It's actually a good note to close on, because here in the United States, you know, we want to make sure that we, you know, double our efforts and triple our efforts, because we do see a shift in public opinion. And there is actually a bill that was presented in Congress, the Betty McCollum bill 2590. And, you know, the basis of that is the inhumane treatment of Palestinian children. And, you know, it's just a shame that still has not become law yet. And that's what makes this much more essential for us. And that's why we have to continue our advocacy. And that is why AMP is a proud sponsor of AJP Action's Virtual Advocacy Days, which is less than 2 weeks out. I want to make sure that you are all ready, and I want you please to sign up and be a part of this great event. You probably think you have to go read a bunch of emails and look through our website again, so you can get your head around what's actually happening starting Monday, September 19th. If you're short on time and want to get a sense of VPAD in a nutshell, we've got you covered. We just released this 90-second video on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook breaking down how Palestine Advocacy Days will unfold to get you ready to fight for Palestine on Capitol Hill as effectively as you possibly can. So with that, I will close, and I want to thank all of our phenomenal panelists. Thank you for joining us. So please check out this video and please share it with your family and friends. Thank you.
Welcome to AJP Action's Palestine Advocacy Days, the largest annual advocacy event for Palestinian rights in the U.S. Let's walk you through how it works. First, you can register for this event by going to ajpaction.org. Once you're registered, you will have access to our 3-part program. Day 1, Advocacy Training Course. On this day, you will hear from some of the leading advocates and Capitol Hill professionals on the American political process and how to effectively advocate for Palestine in Congress. Day 2, Public Plenary. You will hear from members of Congress and prominent speakers on Palestine. Learn what members of Congress are doing about Palestine. Attend the Champion of Palestinian Rights Awards ceremony. Get inspired by top experts and their vision for a free Palestine. Days 3 to 5, Congressional Meetings. On these days, we will guide you through meetings with your senators and House representatives to advocate for Palestine. These meetings are the most critical part of Advocacy Week. You will first meet with a team lead, where you and your fellow constituents will prepare for the congressional meetings and divide up speaking roles. We will schedule these meetings for you, so all you have to do is utilize our training and manual to prep, show up, and advocate for Palestine. Thank you for being part of this groundbreaking effort. Together, we can make a difference for Palestine.